Copyright in these lectures is either owned by the ANU or a third party who has licensed the ANU to use it. Students may use the recording for personal study only. No lecture may be communicated online, copied or shared without the prior permission of the ANU.
Okay, so it seems like after the midterm, everybody's actually asleep maybe. So we have unbelievable number of students today. So today's class is very special, so you're going to be very valuable lesson they're going to miss. So first I actually want to say something because many students was yesterday, last day before the exams, actually the same day, they come to ask me several questions, actually several of them come to ask, and then I realized you guys have this one problem with the quotation of the foreign exchange rate. And I think the main reason is some of you have taken maybe foreign exchange market from other professor, and that seems to confuse you a lot. So I can't compare, I'm not going to say I'm right, he's wrong, whatever, but I'm just going to show you, okay? So let's say the main confusing. Let me show you what it is. So let's say when I say USD over AUD equals 1.33, okay, what I will mean to say is 1 USD equals to 1.33 AUD. Okay? It's $1 equals 1.33 AUD. And these two are equivalent. And if you don't believe they're equivalent, you can on both sides divide by AUD, right? So from here, if both sides divide by AUD, you're getting this. Is that right? Now, this is just mathematically. So maybe for you guys, some students claim if this is the value, that's the value we know on the market, right? About $1 is equals 1.3. I'm keeping having students arguing with me, this should mean this. Okay, this last one, which I'm going to, this is red, and I'm going to say this is wrong. That's the quotations I want to see, and this is wrong. That's what I'm saying, okay? Now, the correct one, if this is a market value, the correct quotation should be this. Okay, now I'm going to first show you the market. Let's just Google it. Now, this is wonderful, everything Google, right? Actually, you can just say direct US dollar over AUD. Okay, sorry, we need over sign. Right? And we just do Google search. What are they going to show me? Okay, today is 1.7. That's also fine. We're just using hypothetical example. You're getting it? Right? And if you have AUD over USD, this will be AUD over USD. We can, of course, let's just we can just do directly. This is USD, right? Now, if you could, we're using 0.7, of course. Okay, fine. Today's rate is 0.7. We're going to use 0.7. Is that what we just searched, Google searched, right? This is rates quoted on the market. And this is the actual value. And this is wrong. I don't know, some students are arguing the previous teacher might taught them in this way. I don't think they teach them in this way. We might have, I don't know, some notations is definitely the teacher, I don't think if a reasonable teacher shouldn't put an equal sign in this. He might use some notation of something, I don't know, because I can't guess what he did. He might use some other notation, something. Oh, sorry, what I'm keeping doing. He might use some other notation, you get confused or something. But it doesn't matter. I'm just going to show you exactly what the market is going to tell you. Right? And if you're going to do AUD over USD, and you're going to get 0.73. Okay. So first I'm showing you this. This is the way the slides are on the exam. Everything is correct there. So there was no mistakes there. Okay. If you're still confused how your previous teacher gets you confused, you can go ahead and do it, but you can just forget about it. Because I'm also going to show you why this market, this way the market show you the quotation is the best one to use. I mean, first of all, that's how the market is using, right? You want to be consistent with how the market codes them. Now, second, if you're thinking, I'm going to show you why this is most the intuitive way. And this is allowing you to be really thinking fast like those traders. Why? Now, I'm going to get rid of the wrong one now so that we can leave it there. No matter. Doesn't matter, we don't need to. Just not only focus on the first column. Say US dollar over AUD equals 1.77. how do you intuitively understand it, and knowing this makes perfect sense? And that's why the market use it. It's not only because market use it, it makes perfect sense. Thinking US dollar is a currency, right? And a currency represents a value, certain kind of value in it. Now, Australia dollar is also a currency, represents certain value. Now, when you have something US dollar over Australia dollar, is like 1 US dollar over 1 Australia dollar. What is the ratio, or what's the multiple between these two values, right? So you know US dollar is more expensive than AUD. You immediately know the US dollar over AUD, those two values being divided, you're going to get a number larger than 1, right? And how much larger? Gets exactly. It is 1.37 times as AUD, right? That's exactly the right value ratio here. Can you, at the very back, can you see? Can you see at the very back? Nobody is responding to me, but I'm just going to make it bigger for you, easy for you guys, right? Right, so it's exactly, so the value of USD is 1.7 times over Australia dollar. Very intuitive, right? Now, if you do cross rates, let's say we also have US dollar over British pound is 0.5, I don't know, let's me using 0.6 probably nowadays, or even higher than that could be. I don't exactly remember. Right, so now let's this, right? Now, if you want to get cross rates, remember this is purely math now, right? You have a value, a number over something else by getting a number. It's purely become a math. So if you want to get cross rate, you just have the first one divided by the second one. It's math, right? Remember the fraction, when you do the division of fraction, if you have the top one, divide by bottom one, what did you get? You have GBP, now move on to the top, over AUD, right? And on the sides, you get exactly the value divided, which is 1.7 divided by 0.6, right? And it equals some number. I'm not going to calculate here. I can actually pretty easy, right? So it will become 0.21. The 0.2177 forever, right? No, 665. So am I correct? Yeah, I think so. Something, yeah, close enough. Does it? Can you see it now? So for any currency, then if I have this GBP over AUD is this, then if I have AUD over RMB, RMB is actually using Chinese yuan, right? This is the notation. Equals now, let's say about 5, right? Now, if from these two I want cross rates of GBP and the Chinese yuan, how do I do it? Because one AUD at the bottom, one AUD on the top. Instead of using divide, now I use multiple, right? And if you multiple these two, on the side, the AUD on the top and the bottom cancels out. You're left with this, and then here will be 2.17 multiple 5, right? Then you get the number. Now you do see how easy this is? I don't know. This is making up a number. It might be not exactly the rates on the market right now. Now you realize how easy this is, right? You never need to think about what's the foreign currency, what's the domestic currency, is it direct quote or indirect quote? You don't never need to think about this at all, right? And for most of the time, none of this is our currency anyway. Right? They're both just some currency. You never need to remember saying, oh, it direct quotes, then I go this way, indirect quotes, I do other way. You don't need to. This is purely become mathematical, one currency value over another currency value. Right? They can both be foreign currency. Is it clear now? Okay. Now then it becomes very easy. Then even when you convert, it becomes very easy to convert. Once you know the rates, right, you know very easy to convert. So if you have 1 British pounds equals one currency equals so much, so if you convert British pounds to Chinese yuan, you know you're going to multiply these rates, right? Because it's 1 British pound equals the Chinese yuan goes to the sides. Right? And if you want a Chinese yuan to British pounds, you're going to have 1 over 10.85. Right? So in this case, let's say you have 1 British pound, sorry, here. You have 1 British GBP, you want to convert to Chinese yuan, what you do? You multiply Chinese yuan on both sides, right? This is what you do, right? And now if you want, this is Chinese yuan, right? That's how you get, so then if you have 1 billion British pound, you just have this rates multiple 1 billion. Now what if I have 1 Chinese yuan, I want to go into British pounds, right? Then you both sides divide. You're going to just have 1 over 1.85 GBP. It's just all math now, right? And this is like elementary. Is that third grade elementary, right? It's just our 3rd year 3年级小学3年级 primary school math. You don't really need to know the Arcane codes at all. And that's why you're wondering, you know, on the market, why those traders can think so fast? This is why. It's just simple math. It's just simple, really simple small numbers. Good enough? And you could have if you were confused by your previous teacher, you could have figured out easily by just Google it to check it, what it is. Now we clear? Okay, very good. Now, related to this, I have actually think for a while since last night, do I want to talk to you guys or not? Then today, when I prepare, you know, I was looking through this lecture I'm going to do, then I decided I'm going to tell you something extra, which is not related to the course, but related to the culture of maybe students and professor relations. Okay. If the students in the class, you emailed me last night, and I emailed you back, don't get offended. I'm going to use your email example, and actually last night, so there was a student, she wrote me an email after your midterm exam, and she's very, I wouldn't say she's upset or anything, she's basically saying she was very confused with the math, the calculation questions. And in the end of the conversation, the email back and forth, she's thinking I got very offended, and I can tell you, if you are in the classroom, I'm not particularly offended. I should be offended, but I'm actually not, because I understand how exactly why you're behaving that way, and I want to sort of just enlighten you, all of you here, right? So basically, she started email saying, "Good evening. I think there are mistakes on the exam. The calculation question of Q21 is a completely mess." And then he shows me that US dollar over AUD equals 1.03, which means 1 Australia dollar equals 1.3 USD, so your question doesn't make sense. Okay, so this goes on. Okay, what do you guys think of this email? And of course, he goes on, there's other things are my mistake, blah, blah. And she's very clear at multiple choice. Then come to the calculation question, she's very, I forgot the word, she's confused or something. Then she said, "I don't mean to offend you." Okay, so that's the whole email. If you are in the classroom, I'm not trying to embarrass you or anything. I'm just using this to teach you guys a real valuable lesson, which doesn't mean you guys didn't do anything wrong, but it's will be very valuable for you to know. What do you guys think of that email? Now, I would like you guys to think in two things. First, would you ever write an email, I mean, yourself first thinking, would you thinking of, even if you think this, would you write an email like that to me? Or if you're going to write, are you going to write using different sentence? That's the first question you think about us. You don't need to answer me. I'm asking you to think first. Second question I would like you to think is, if instead of me, there is a very big, tall, white man standing here, maybe he is in his 40s, 50s, would you ever consider writing that email to him? Did you thinking through this? I'm not trying to be absolutely there. I'm just going to tell you something actually very interesting in the university, everywhere, not just here, or human behavior. Okay, so now you're thinking through this, right? Now, what's wrong with that student's email? I can understand she's upset. She couldn't do the math, and she's thinking, I make a mistake, right? Now, but here is something. What can make a person to think when I see something in the exam and I don't understand, I get confused, the first response is the professor has been making mistake. To send you guys the exam, there will be not only me, there will be another professor looking at, and I have been teaching 12 years. And even if I haven't been teaching for 12 years, I think I got more school education in finance subject as well before I become professor. I have had 4 years of a good university education, and another 2 years of master, and another 5 years of PhD, and I have been basically doing finance and math for my past, how many years? 24 years. But her first response is the teacher made a mistake. I'm not saying there's anything particularly she is a bad student or anything. It's common. It's common not just because she is a student. It's common because, I'm going to say this is the important part, because I'm a woman, I'm Asian, and I look young, and I'm not tall. This is almost the study have finding. In the teaching evaluation, on average, male, white, tall, older, getting much better teaching evaluation than female, short, Asian, what's that, young, yes. This is a behavioral bias, and most of students have. They do without recognize they have such bias. It's not, I feel inferior or anything. It's a reality that they have systematic studies across the university looking at the teaching evaluation. They find this. That's the first evidence. Second evidence, or the field evidence. Female professors are likely to be offered suggestion help from the students much more than male professors. Now, this is, again, it's okay. Students, they feel, oh, I thinking there's something here. I would like to give a suggestion to the professor. This is very welcome, normal, right? But what they find is the students are more likely to go to the female professor saying, I'm offering you suggestions. That's, again, a bias. And I can tell you, over my 12 years of teaching, I receive those suggestions or complaints in the teaching evaluation. Sometimes are just completely ridiculous. Because when people offer suggestions, sometimes it could be genetic, is really a suggestion that is helpful for everyone. Sometimes it's just this student's particular preference. For example, print the slides every page 2 slides instead of 1 slide. What do you think of this suggestion? Is this a suggestion particularly good for teaching, for communication among professors and students, or this is a suggestion just to reflect that student's personal preference, right? Because he prefers 2 slides printed on 1 page, while many other students maybe prefer 1 slide per page so there's space to write. Or some other students might prefer 3 slides on 1 page, or even 6 slides on page to save the papers or the heavy, the notes you carry with, right? This is a purely individual preference. But I often receive, this is just one example. Those individual preference are helpful suggestion to me for teaching. Okay, I'm saying this not because I'm upset about this or anything. I want you guys to know how severe the unconscious bias people have. And now I'm using an example as you are students, I'm professor as students, how students view professor or evaluate professor or approach professor with that unconscious bias. This is important for you to learn, is also for yourself, because when you be somewhere, interact with people, they will have same kind of unconscious bias towards you, right? There is no need to get offended, but you should understand how it comes from, and you should also understand it's okay for you to stand up for that. There's no need to lose temper or something, but you need to understand where he comes from. And he may not intentionally prejudice against you or anything, because we are all human. Got it now? I can give you other example. For example, I have people come to my office, call me Miss or Mr. Chair. And one of worst example is Mr. Chair, which, okay, I understand it's an English issue, right? But, Miss, I don't know, Mr., I don't I'm Chair. That's not my husband's last name. That's my own last name, Chair. So I'm not Mr. Chair, definitely. Miss Chair, when you call a professor like that, I don't know. Australia, we have students from China, Australia, or other place. I don't think none of the culture have the tradition of calling a teacher Miss. But I got almost every year, there will be students just come to my office, feel comfortable to call me Miss. I don't get offended because I told you that's what happens. Would you, thinking about students, would you consider going into a male professor's office just to call, what would be the equivalent of Miss? I don't know. A boy or a gentleman or something, right? I think you would at least call Mr. or Doctor or teacher or professor. This is, again, a signal of unconscious bias. We are human, we behave in that way, and you probably need to watch yourself try not to behave in that way, and you may actually meet other people treat you with that unconscious bias. I can offer you other example. For example, it's just not students, among even colleagues. NU actually is doing pretty good, particularly in CBE, doing very good in terms of gender equity. I myself is on gender equity committee. We do a lot of things trying to reduce those unconscious bias to promote or people treat each other equal, or those things, right? One typical example is, maybe I shouldn't use example. Let's refer you studies. I refer you other experimental studies or field studies about how this bias could be. Some bias coming from our human weakness of treating other people unconsciously biased. Some bias coming from maybe ourselves behaving in a certain way. For example, the studies finding women, not just a woman professor, women on general working in corporation or or anywhere tends to ask less for pay, or I mean, in other words, men compared to women, men tends to more likely to negotiate for pay and more likely to apply for promotion, while women do much less. And on the casual conversation, if they want to make negative comments about a hypothetical person, there's much higher chance they use she or her instead of he or him. Okay. And if when in the casual talk, when men ask, like colleagues, more tends to ask, how is your work going? How is your day? Or just casual, or how is your work going? To women, other than how you are doing, they are more likely to ask, how is your kid? Okay, these are all friendly, but these are not, nothing is hostile or anything. I tell you this is make you aware of this. Understand? And actually, we have many girls here. So girls, you need to learn. Sometimes they did it, they don't have bad intention. But you need to be aware. Okay? And also when you approach other people, be aware that you might be making those unconscious bias. And on this, NU is doing very good. NU is also have this respectful, is establishing this called respectful relationship points that you guys probably going to hear very soon, because in our committee we have been talking about it. So this is going to announce to you. This is purely to promote how people treat each other with respect to trying to reduce this unconscious bias. But of course, sometimes you may meet people who are consciously biased against you, then you really need to learn how to be smarter and tough at the same time. But other time, a lot of those times, the bias is because people are unconscious. And then you need to be aware how you behave. Don't let people enforce on this unconscious bias. Okay? This is valuable life lesson. Free, no tuition, you need to pay for this. Okay, now let's, did you guys have anything you want to ask because of the midterm? Go ahead.
About finance structure and finance side.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure capital.
Market cap.
Yeah, market cap ratio.
Is the total market cap divided by GDP. So most of the ratio is, like on that slide, shows it just over GDP.
But in this case, the ratio is minus, is negative.
If you take log, it could be minus. But that will be, when you do when you do the financial structure, is market over bank, so the ratio will be GDP will be cancelled out, right? So if it's negative, that means it's smaller than 1, the ratio is smaller than 1, just means the market is smaller than the bank, right? Now, if it's finance size, that is 1 log value of ratio plus another log value of ratio, right? That would be, even you're adding them together, it's negative. What he's basically saying is the size of the market is smaller than the size of total GDP. So it's smaller than 1, so you take a value, it becomes negative.
And in the multiple choice questions, I quite confused with the case they are family managed, just family oriented. I'm not sure what family structure in Chinese it's unique. I don't know. No.
Whether the family ownership is unique to the Asia, is that the question she's saying?
Unique for Asia? I don't think
It's
so.
not. That will be a long statement. It's not unique to Asia. Yeah.
Yes, and state-owned in China is not unique
is not unique either. Yes. So not today's class. The next 2 weeks class will be, I will be more elaborate on the state ownership around the world, family ownership around the world more. Because that part so far we just learned in China as a general sort of explanation for the general China's growth path. Any other questions? No. I'll go ahead.
For the initial questions, I'm confused about the future, the maturity of the future.
The futures market should be, because I was only giving you the interest rate for 6 months. So the futures market has to be those expires in 6 months. Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to do anything, right? Because 1 year, every time point, the future price means what's traded on the market now for the contract expires in the future, right? So if I give you something in 1 year, 2 years, you wouldn't be able to do anything for 6 months. It has to be the same time with the interest rate. So in that question, if I want to be very wordy, then it would be saying it's the current market future price for contract that expires in 6 months. But I don't say that because it's redundant. I'm giving you only interest rate for 6 months. Let me think. Maybe because that class was taught by Takashi. So maybe let me refresh you guys a bit. So at every moment, time point on the market, there will be spot market, there will be future market. On spot market, there's a lot of instruments. On the futures market, there's a lot of instruments, and the contract expire different day. So at each time point, or this very seconds, there will be price for this security on spot market, and then the security on the futures market. And on the futures market might have multiple futures price for different expiring date. Right. So this is this moment he had also. Then when the time moves, next time point, you're going to have a new set of all this price again. Now you understand, right? So, no, actually, this is. Okay, good enough? Very good. So we're going to talk about, let's talk about today's class then. I'm going to get rid of this. Why is keeping coming up? I said, have you made it? Do you want to save change it? I don't save. Okay, finally. Should be able to see, right? Okay. Okay, so today we're going to talk about neoliberalism. Okay, so it's, if you're thinking about the language's origin, it's basically two parts. It's neo and liberalism. Okay. Now, so we're going to talk about what is neoliberalism and how is it developed around the world and what's the result of this, and then is this idea of neoliberalism is oversold. This has been going on around, it's actually, let me put it this way, it's the major theme of the global economy in the last half century, or even a bit longer than that, more than half century, 70 years almost. Right, so this is, and this shapes up the global structure economy in many countries, and explains all the cause behind a lot of events happens. So that's what I'm going to talk. So that's the whole today's class. We're going to focus on this. And to do this, I wanted to first to introduce some terminology. And this terminology, you must actually see it all the time, but without thinking very much. Okay. So to have a best understanding or put yourself in the mindset that gets you into this, understand this, what is neoliberalism about, is to thinking yourself is actually some policy makers, the policy maker of each individual country, or maybe just a policy economist in an international organization like IMF or World Bank, or just thinking of yourself as a philosophy or observer of the society, how it goes, right? So that's why you put yourself, a bit stepping back, have a big picture view. So let me first introduce this, what these terms are. Even though you have seen it every day, it will help you to really think what's behind. First is free market. The idea of the word free market basically means this ideology or a system that let the demand and the supply to determine the price of the goods on the market. And this determination process are not going to be affected by government control or intervention or some monopoly or some other political or violent whatever force, military force. So free from all the external forces. Just let the market demand and supply, and this market demand and supply is free demand and supply, purely from people's consumption needs and to the demands and the quality of goods determined by the productivities or technologies. This is called free market. So the demand and the supply only depends on the utility satisfaction of the consumers and the production determined by this technology and how much producers they are, and to determine the price and the quantity in the equilibrium. No government policy influence, no monopoly power influence. Okay, that's called free markets. Right. Okay, and from here you can relate to many your understanding of the economy when they call them free markets or they call them not free markets. You can apply where this applies. Right. So like I said, in this course, I want you guys to learn to independently thinking about the economy and this world rather than just listening to whatever people are trying to feed you into. The second terminology is liberalism. The liberalism is actually a political word. It's an ideology, philosophy based on mainly promote liberty and equality. Right? And so it generally just supports the freedom of speech and the religion, press and market, civil rights, sometimes people call also human rights, democratic, and secure government means this government is on serving. Small government serving the economy, serving the people is called secure government. Gender and race equality and international cooperation. That's a lot. So if you are, this is a political term. I'm just trying to think and making you guys understand. If in the Chinese political context, I think in China, this will be called the right side, right? And if in the US context or politics, it will be called the left side, so the Democratic Party. So, and here, and I think Australia have Labour, and it will be also the right side, actually, it's the right side, it's more liberal. Okay, so this is, so liberalism, it's a political ideology. So then if you have them, politics and economics are often together, right? So that's, you often see the democratic countries tends to also have free market, right? And the more controlled countries tends to have less market-oriented economy. So then there's this term of economic liberalism. The economic liberalism is basically this ideology, believes that the economic decision should be made by individual. And they believe the individual are rational. And so then instead of let the institution make the policy, right? And so basically, if the government are going to promote any policy, then those policies should not be intervene the market, but rather help the market to become more efficient. For example, through reduced transaction cost. Right? And then the labor and the capital should have free movement. Right? For example, biggest example is this globalization of whether we can travel to other countries, whether you can work in other countries. And the greatest extreme example will be the European Union. Right? So among those countries, they have free capital flow and labor flows. Now, so that's economic liberalism. Basically, in the economic policy, promotes the liberalism, right? Now, the last one is called socialist economic planning. That will be another extreme. It's in which is basically the resource allocation and the production are all planned by the central government. So that will be the other complete corner of the spectrum from the free market, right? One is free, done by all individual respective market force. The other side is all the planning done by the government. Okay. All good on this terminology? Then we're going to talk about the neoliberalism. Right, so far we talk liberalism economically. What is neoliberalism? It refers to a market-oriented reform. It's reform policies that has been going almost around the world in the past 50, 70 years. And those reforms are targeted at eliminate price controls, deregulate capital market, lowering trade barriers, and reducing state influence, etc. What you see in the reality is global trades, right? WTO, that's global trade. And the government, it's privatization of government ownership. Those firms, even China, US, and many in the UK go through the privatization. And also trying to austerity of government, reducing government budget deficits. That goes on in many countries, but not in US. But we're going to talk about each country experience later on. Right? This is what you have experienced in the I'm suddenly thinking I didn't update my slides. Yeah, I was. Never mind, but I think it's okay. I will after our updates, there will be some YouTube link that you can see, right? So this is the neoliberalism that has been going on. So in the Washington Consensus, because US has been the dominant one, right? This is basically a development of market reform. Right? China goes through all of that a lot as well. And so in this reform, the policies is going to give more power to the individuals, right? And then along the same time, trying to promote a political freedom and promote social values and minimize government rules, etc. Now, this idea comes from Hayek in the 40s. I think he's in the 40s. How many of you knows his book, The Freedom to Serfdom? A Chinese translation. I think it's called 通往奴役之路. Anyway, this is the most famous book he wrote, and then he was become a Chicago professor, etc. So the basic idea is he promotes the free market. Thinking of in the 1940s, which after the World War, around the time after World War, thinking the economic state at that time, for all around the world, most of the government have tight control of the economy. Right? Will be much like China today, or even more controlling. And so he is the ones that promote this free market. It's more like a philosophy. It's a philosophy to promote. And so then he talked about the boundary between the government, where the government should stop, let the market plays a role. And so you might heard of people like Keynes and Friedman. They all come after him. Okay, he was actually much earlier than them. Okay, so that's the liberalism side. And then after, so that's also part of the reason, the University of Chicago economics become really a major player since all those years as well. Now then I'm going to talk about each country's experience in the past maybe 50 years of doing this, how they experience, or some country maybe 70 years. So the first story we're going to talk about is Argentina. And Argentina went through two sets of the liberalism. And if you guys are interested in history and even music stuff and movie stuff, Argentina had a bunch of movies made around this time. Okay. The first wave is done in the 1970s. And the major thing they did is they trying to do the fiscal austerity. That means they shrink the government, reduce the government expenditure, so reduce the government debt, right? And the results actually turns out pretty bad because to stop the government spending, recall what we talked on the Euro crisis lecture, what happens? You have to reduce government investment, right? And when you reduce investment government, you actually reduce possible. If the economy has been heavily reliant on government spending or government investment, suddenly you shrink that. What happens to the economy? Recession, all right? So the result is they have a lot of frozen of salary, and because they couldn't pay out. Then have a lot of high inflation because the production can't go on. Then the supply is limited, right? So the price of goods goes up. And the real income drop because of the recession. So that doesn't work very well. The second one is they do the open door free market, which means reduce the capital and the trade barrier across board, right? That's the international trade part. And the results is actually also not good. As you might understand, if you open your door freely to compete with other foreign companies, what might happen to you if your domestic company have low technology, low productivity? You're going to lose the market, right? Because they are not competitive enough. And when you lose the market, the industry will shrink instead of developing. And this will happen to Argentina. So the domestic industry get destroyed because of incapability of compete. Another aging example exactly falling into this is Philippines. Now that you guys have heard of Philippines as a poor country, Philippines made is like most common thing to people's knowing. But in the early 60s or 70s, Philippines is actually one of the major developed countries in relatively, not completely developed, more rich country in the Asia before the Four Dragons start to kick off. But this is similar. Now the third thing Argentina in that way do is deregulation of financial markets. Now deregulation of financial markets in short term usually is good because they remember what is the role of financial market? Reallocate resources, the capitals, right? Those who have the surplus but no good investment project now can let the money flow to those people who have good investment opportunities. Right, so in short term, it was good, but in the long term, it suffered, particularly when the capital flew to USA. Now, on this one, you can relate to the Asian financial crisis. Remember how Asian financial crisis happened? Open the capital market, right? The foreign capital comes in particularly the Thailand bank had a lot of short-term borrowing in US dollars from the foreign investors, right? And then those money, once they borrow, they lend into the domestic economy, into investment project. Many of them are long-term investment project. But when you have, now this is Asian financial crisis we talked, right? Now if you go further back to in the first class, we talk about the bank's business type, model. So if the bank are making long-term investment and they have short-term borrowing, they have to keep rolling over the short-term borrowing, right? What if they can't roll over? They need to pay back those debt, but the bank's assets is on those long-term project can't have. That will have bank run, right? And the capital, then the investors falling back to the Asian crisis time, the foreign investor lost the confidence of the economy of the bank. They want all the capital want to flow out. That will cause a currency crisis, then economic crisis. And this happens in Argentina as well. Right? And so the result, the total result of it is before they do this policy, Argentina's poverty line is 9%. That means 9% of the population live underneath the poverty line. After this destruction, it rises to 40% in 1982. So 40%, almost half of the people live under poverty lines. Okay, so from here, I'm not trying to promote anything or anything, but I just let you as an economist, or you guys are able to think as well, to reflect this on China's policy in the past 40 decades. Think what actually could have allowed China to grow, because China wasn't impacted by Asian financial crisis, wasn't impacted by the subprime global crisis, right? Didn't have those capital outflow. Why? Capital is controlled. It's not just government, it's just a policy there. Capital is controlled. There's no free flow of capital, right? So those capital flow things wouldn't happen. And was there a fiscal austerity? No, the government was keep spending, right? A lot of banks, like China Investment Bank, etc., were all the investment arm of the government. And regulation of financial market, this is probably it's probably the worst one in terms of China's the liberalism, but also actually keep China relatively safe for a long time, but not always. Actually, right now, I see a big problem there. But from this, you can see, right? China has been always attacked being too close, but it's also, yes, there's a lot of policies they could have making more liberal, more free, but it's also a lot of this control, allowing China's domestic industry to develop to a certain level, the market to develop, so give certain time of stability. Right? So I know you guys probably hear a lot of in China the debates for the past 40 years, always arguing the government is bad in everything. They should be more free, open the capital market, let our money go out, blah, blah. It's not necessarily going to benefit you. It looks like, yes, if I could move all my money to Australia or US dollar, my assets are going to save. It's not necessarily going to benefit you. Okay, it's no clear thing. But I didn't mean it should be the same way going forward. Because once your economy pick up, your domestic industry develop, you need a new competition. Otherwise, it's going to be monopoly, and there's going to be lack of incentive to innovate. Right? And then you will never be ready for international competition if you always be closed. So it's really about a timing. And right. Now, this is Argentina experience in the first wave. The second wave, Argentina, so there is in the 90s, mainly because the first wave was so bad, the economy was in a really shabby situation, and then the politics, they had a lot of politics turbulence because of that as well. So in the 90s, they had a relatively stable time. The new stronger government come in, they start to a new wave of neoliberalism. This time, they're trying to privatize the government sector, right? So they have go through this privatization, and then they re-implement the financial deregulation and free market in international trade. And the results, again, not good. The unemployment rose to 25%, and the poverty line rose to 60%. Go ahead.
I want to know why the first point is not good for the.
Why the privatization of public service is not good. In a minute, did I maybe actually come right away? Do I talk about rushing the right next one? No, I can tell you here now. Privatization of public service, we mentioned a little bit in China, and actually next week we're going to talk more, right? The main incentive to privatize is thinking if we let the individual private run the business, they will have better incentive to do a good job, right? But there's a lot of problem during this privatization process, right? How the ownership goes to the government-owned to the individuals, right? So in this process, you could have corruption. The assets might go to people who are not good at running, but are just trying to gain profits out of this. That's one problem. Another problem, you could have if you're looking around the world, even in the most liberal country like the US, there are certain industries are controlled by the government. They are typically like electricity, energy, telecommunication, and those aerospace stuff. All those that are fundamentally important for people's daily life, for the national security, all countries control them, right? And particularly, so those are important for people's daily life. For example, electricity, water, stuff, gas, those things. If you let the private run, and those companies relies on the big network, that means they tend to be monopoly. And in the monopoly market, if you can still, I don't know whether you guys remember, if you have taken microeconomic class, in monopoly market compared to a competitive market, the monopoly market will tend to improve the price, increase the price, reduce the quantity, right? And they higher profit margin. Now, if you're thinking of those water, energy, electricity goes into this market, what happens to people and the factories, to the manufacturers? The cost increase, right? Their basic production cost increase. And when the production cost increase, what happens? Many firms may not be able to survive, right? Less products is produced, then those products become more expensive. Then inflation comes in, shrink of industry comes in. You see the chain reaction? Okay, so this is an Argentina experience, and this is not it's a very sad story, and it's a lot of, I think you guys probably have watched, you guys should have some impression. How many people know this Eva who sings this Don't Cry For Me, Argentina? The movie was actually based on one of those events at the time. Okay, Chile experience. So in Chile, what they do? Okay, the radical economic reform happened in the late 70s, which about the same time as Argentina. And what at that time they do is the rapid extension of privatization. And they do financial deregulation, they reduce international trade barrier, all those liberal policies, right? Reduce state role, etc. The results is also not very good. So basically they widen the inequality. So wealthiest income grow by 83%, but then 40, that means the top wealthiest people's income grows almost doubled. But the poverty line rise to 45%. But 45 people live beneath the poverty line. Now, but the Chile's experience in this is relatively better than Argentina because on the political side, they actually maintained relatively more stable. So they made advancement in terms of democracy, but the economic actually is going backward. Now, This is very important. In the wealthiest, the gross income by 83%, and more become on the poverty line. It's the income gap or the divert, right? And what else we see this? So it'll be the next one. I should have had a slide about Russian. No? No, I don't. I think I probably didn't use Russian at all. Right? So the Russian, you guys know, it's a shock therapy, right? Again, the privatization, like they go from this state-controlled economy, like China 40 years ago, goes into a free market like the US model. They want to plan it like at right this time point from this day, switch to the next day, we're going to switch the system. And that's called a shock therapy. And the result was also very bad. And that's why you see a lot of movie pictures of very rich Russian billionaires, trillionaires. They get rich over this overnight privatization. And then they had a lot of people goes very poor. And nowadays they're much better. Even Russia in the 90s, that when they come to visit China, even, really a fun or some real small appearance is like very precious to them. Anyway, so that's the rapid privatization is often a cause of many people getting rich overnight, and you probably heard of the story like that in China as well, but not as dramatic. Okay, this is the child's experience, and then the Germans' experience. Right. The Germans' experience is probably almost the best among all the neoliberalism. But what they do is, they did, remember the term we talk about social economic planning and free market. But German did is something called a social market economy. It's somewhere in between. Right? They don't have to keep complete planned economy. They are free market. But their policy is promoting a lot of social values. So the rules, the government focus is a policy that's going to promote the competition and actually better the monopoly. They want to limit the monopoly, so they don't, right? And then they also promote a lot of social promote values while they at the same time promote economic efficiency. One typical example that, because I'm a financial economist, I like to mention is in almost all the countries, the banks make loan to the firm, and if the firm go bankruptcy, right, the bank will just let it go bankruptcy. But in German, and in also actually in Japan, but it's slightly different. Japan was, we're going to talk 2 weeks from today, we're going to talk about how Japan runs. But in German, the bankruptcy law, it actually allows the bank to take the ownership of the firm. Right? So that gives them more room, also engage the bank more, are willing to monitor the firms and try to help the firms. And when the firms are in financial distress, the bank will have a saying of whether they should restructure the firm, or the bank even taking the equity of the firm to run it until they're healthy again, then the bank exits. While in most of the countries, banks are not allowed to convert their debt into equity. That will be one very typical example of the Germans' more socio-economic. Because in this, what happens, you're thinking it's not just the arrangement of whether you're allowed to take equity. Because in this process, whose interests they have been watching out? Not just for bank, you're watching out for all those employees' interest, right? If the bank cannot be able to, or the security law does not allow the bank to step in, the firm will go bankruptcy, people get unemployed, right? But if you allow bank to step in, you save those people and you give the company another chance. Okay. So this is the German experience. And then the China's experience is also, that's, you guys are very familiar, it's called a social market economy. That's what China called since the 1980s. Now, the difference between the German's social economy and China's social economy is China actually allowing the state control. right? So it started in the 80s, and the market reform still with centralized authorization, and there's only partial competition and partial privatization. That you guys, most of you are very familiar, right? The partial competition is you can imagine all those private firms are compete, right? And the situation is actually they have to be very competitive to be able to survive. But then another part of the economy is have a lot of monopoly powers. And some of the private companies with special whatever connections are having monopoly as well. Right, that's part. And then they have partial privatization. Most of the privatization done in China is actually by selling some of the shares on the market, while the state still control maybe 40%, 50%, 30% of the firm. Right? So they let the private force come in, but at the same time maintain the government control. As China's experience, and you have to say, looking at all the countries' growth, its results is quite impressive. And the U.S. experience, right? So U.S., this neoliberal policy started in the 70s. So they free the enterprise system, intellectual infrastructure. In the 80s, they cut tax, financial deregulation, blah, blah, right? And in the 90s, they do a lot of free trade agreements, blah, blah, until the WTO was established. So you guys are clear of that. Now, so all this because on the economy side, U.S. is possibly, or in terms of free market, is done most thorough in all those countries, right? But what they didn't do well, government debt, right? At the same period, their government debt actually goes skyrocket high. Now, China is going a lot of debt problem nowadays as well. It's in that matter. Now, UK experience. So UK is that in the 1980s, and with Margaret Thatcher, which, yeah, our girls should be admiring. This is a role model for the girls. And so they do tax reduction, exchange rate reform. That was particularly had an experience with Soros attack their Pagidan system, which I talked 3 weeks ago on this, right? The financial deregulation and the privatization. So they did actually quite successful. So this is, UK is probably, other than US, is the one in the Western world that doing the liberalism actually quite successful. And, yeah. And then Australia experience, it's also implemented in 80s, mainly focused on privatization, free market, again, free, the capital currency free market, or reduction in the trade protection, right? And in this relative to this to students is in that they also had a repayable loan system established for university education, partially out of this austerity of the government to reduce the government debt or reduce the government spending. So before this system was established, the Australian citizens actually can go to university free. And so then to reduce, because the expenses were all coming from the government expenditure, right? So to reduce this, they actually implement a loan system. You can apply the loan from the government and then pay back that loan after you graduate. And this is still today. Right? So it all depends on where you come from. When they had that system established, there was a lot of complaint among the people because it's go from free to need to pay. Right? So if in another country, it always needs to be paid, then you have a loan system, people would be actually very happy. Right? And this loan system was involving in this policy design is one of our professors at CBE, and he's still here. Okay. And then there was quite a lot of criticism that I think I'm going to come to. Let me just say the overall assessment of neoliberalism, right? So we showed many countries' experience. So basically from this experience, it's inconclusive on the results of economic outcome when they implement the neoliberalism, right? In some country, it goes well. In some country, it goes very bad. There's a detail of how you implement actually was much important, or to what degree and what timing. The effect varies from country to country and also varies over time. Now, in terms of inequality, it's clear for almost every country. Not only those countries go through the bad economic results like Argentina or Chile or Russia, but also in countries that have good results like in US, UK, and China and Germany. The income inequality increases. The rich become richer and the poor becomes poorer. That's almost an inevitable thing. I hope I shouldn't say inevitable, but it's a common thing for the capitalist countries these days. And then the third main points of this, the growth targets has to include, so the best point is, have to include distributional effects, because in the long run, when you have inequality, it's going to affect sustainability, and it's going to hurt the economy in the end, right? So at the early stage of the policy, it will be helpful if to consider the distribution of the wealth or the income at a much early stage. And this is a challenge that probably China is facing right now. Okay. So let's take 20 minutes break, and then when we come back, I talk more about the detailed criticism on this neoliberalism.
Currency crisis
is a kind of financial crisis.
I still have some question about the exchange rate. There is the explanation of the textbook of CFA. It says US dollar means $1 dollar.
Yeah, but he doesn't say there's an equal sign here. So this will be some kind of representation, but it doesn't mean I have an equal sign. This is two different things, right? That's when you say this exchange rate of whatever number, I don't know what is representation, because it's a notation he is using. And then you have to understand what's the notation. This one, I'm just using the market. So what you basically you want to arguing right now, if you don't realize what you are doing is, you are arguing because of that textbook you're finding, the whole market is wrong. Did you realize what you are arguing for?
So the whole market is wrong.
Do you think the whole market is wrong, or that is wrong? Or you misunderstood what that text is?
So it means the market is right and the CFA is wrong. And
what is CFA is wrong?
So
I think you misunderstood. I have been trying to be very polite. You don't get it.
All right. CFA gave us several types to show the exchange rate.
okay, maybe there are several kinds. Both are right. So could you please?
I don't know other ones. This is the right one. That's what I'm telling you.
So you.
But when one person, another person write a textbook or something, he using a notation. That's what I'm saying. He says this of this rate means this. He didn't use this notation of equal sign there.
Okay, maybe it's my misunderstanding.
You are misunderstanding. You have to understand that person write that textbook. What is the framework he is setting up?
So.
And all I'm telling you is, use this market one. This is the most simple, correct one.
That's correct. So could you please, before the final, you give us some instructions about some of the defaults? How
This is a default market.
Okay.
Because this market one don't need any special setup. If you want to go follow some textbook or somewhere you find, then don't apply to the market. You can apply it when you are studying that textbook. But don't apply to the market and then come back saying the market is wrong.
We must follow the market style.
Exactly. That's the point.
So in the some New York exchange, that they use this notation as well?
It's just the whole market using this notation. Now, see, this is being very, I'm not just saying you are rude, because you just being very, because I keep saying, at a particular setting, they need their setting to do certain things. And they might say something different. For example, I'm giving you a simple example of Chinese words. There's simplified version, there is complicated old version.
Yes.
Are you going to say use this, okay, I went to Taiwan because the Gao wrote like this. So now, come back in the Chinese class, teacher, you are wrong. See, look at this book. The Gao is written in this. And then you go to there and say, oh, in this country, Japan, the Gao is written in this. And you come back and say, this is wrong. The Chinese teacher, give me tomorrow, are you going to give me a guideline of how our Gao is written in every language? And so now your teacher, your Chinese teacher is obligated to teach you the words of Gao is how it's written in Korea, in Japan, in Taiwan, in English, in Germany?
Yeah, I understand what you mean.
No, okay,
Actually,
got it now then.
All right.
Good.
Sorry, I have some questions about the interest rate,
Mm-hmm.
the bond interest rate, because in the last course,
Mm-hmm.
the yield of something 6 months bond means the nominal annual rate. The yield of I mean the 2.5 means the nominal rate of that year, of that half 6 months bond.
It's the nominal rate, yes, because in that question it's redundant. Your investment interest rate, the market is never going to quote you a real rate.
Yeah.
Your nominal rate and real rate is a theoretical number. Just help you understanding.
Yeah. So if I just transfer the nominal rate to the effective annual rate, is that okay?
It is annualized rate. Do not do effective annualized rate. Again, market is not going to be able to give you effective annual rate because effective annual rate is again a theoretical concept.
Theoretical concept.
Because effective rate, say if you're holding a treasury bond, the maturity is 1 year, and the interest rate is 3%.
Yeah.
Your effective rate is 3%, right? Because that's only you getting holding for you. Now, if you are using a monthly instruments, you buy treasury bill of monthly, and the rate quote is also 3%. Now, your theoretical effective rate is going to be 1 plus 3% divided by 12 raised to power 12 minus 1.
Yeah.
Now, did you realize it's a theoretical rate?
Theoretical rate. Okay.
Because that is assuming you're going to invest in these instruments roll over every 12 years. See, you guys, just like this, you guys need to differentiate what is factually market able to coach you versus conceptual understanding. So the effective rate is only giving you a conceptual understanding of if you keep roll of basic compounding.
Yeah, compounding.
That's all. But it only help you the compounding. But in the market, nobody ever going to be able to coach you an effective rate because that is based on the assumption of compounding. Are you able to actually get the compounding with the instruments? It's your investment strategy.
Yeah.
Okay.
Instrument strategy.
That's exactly. But nobody is able to coach you that rate.
Yeah. So if I just do the double compounded in the exam and the rate is not different much.
How can you do double compounding in the question?
Just 1 plus you mean the 3?
Mathematically, I understand you can compound it as many as you want. But how you can, the question is asking you, if the rate is different, how are you going to arbitrage? Now you tell me you're going to compound it. How are you going to do it?
No, just the previous, the second question, and I use the effective rate.
It's the same. It's the same. The market needs to determine an equilibrium price of predicted future rate, right? And how can the market determine the future rate theoretically based on I'm going to keep compounding it? It's the same question.
So
Did you get? I just thinking you are not getting my point of the theoretical things that happens. That theoretically, using your imagination, you can compound almost every day. And practically, for example, credit card interest, they do compound every day. But the market is determined by the normal investors and a lot of investors. How can the market be best getting the rates or giving you the rates of compounding?
yeah, they can.
Exactly. So when they coach you the market rate, essentially, there's no need for you to consider whether it's after compounded. Nobody is going to pay you giving you a compounding rate. It's like, I don't know, nobody is ever going to do that.
So if I do this, does that mean more realistic, or?
Yeah, it's not realistic. That's the right word.
So if I do it in the exam, it means it's wrong.
Well, that's a different question. You should have just asked me that question, which is simple. I'm very nice. I'm just count you as right, as long as you do it right, as long as you compounded it right.
Okay.
But if you have do compounding and messed up in your compounding, then wrong. Then you're not going to get it.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay.
You mentioned about the partially privatization in China,
Mm-hmm.
and I just want to know that why the government wants to these private firms come this field.
I don't know. Could you stress the question again?
The partially private.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Okay. And why the government want to what?
the private firms coming.
Why do they want to do partial? Why do they want to privatize? Okay, is your question is why they want to privatize or why they only do partial?
Partial.
The partial is because government will still want to take the control. And they want to privatize is because they can sell some of the assets to let the individual market to play. If they always hold in the government, they can't let this market mechanism to play.
So it's partially open to. I mean, what's the field? Is that, for example, you say most country control the energy or energy field. So it's just this field partially for the private firms or all field.
In China, almost the majority of the state privatization is going through partial. And the energy is surely just the partial, listed. so many things people living here. little bit before that.
Yes.
So shake the camera. Okay. Okay, let's continue. And I don't mean there's a student there. It's a male student. I don't mean to embarrass you, but maybe you come in after I talk about the unconscious bias. So I'm just using your example to reinforce, and don't feel offended. So remember we talk about the exchange rate, right? I show you the market. So the students comes to me showing me a part of the text from some textbook or, I don't know, CFA or whatever, right? And he said, see here says exchange rate of this over this of this number means this. And he said, it's different from what you showed on the market. Do you guys think it's a fair question for me? It's really not my job to try to correct you guys about the unconscious bias issue. I'm a professor. I teach you, financial market professor. I teach you what exactly market is using and how you could use it. I cannot be responsible or explain to you every book written in this world, how they write about it. Right? And if you see something that reads that is inconsistent with the market, the first thing you need to think about is, what is the first thing you would think about if you think you read something that is inconsistent with the market? I don't know how you guys, but to me, my first response, did I understand it correctly? Am I making some assumption about what he writes here means here? Right? Is there something set up here is different from the market? Or some assumption or some notation? I mean, in this exchange rate, mostly because of the notation. Or this textbook are just using a different notation. And in that situation, I wouldn't go to an irrelevant person arguing, saying, or particular person just told you the market does in this way and showed you actually the market does in this way, saying that person is wrong, this textbook is correct. Okay, so I hope you get the lesson. I think the point I want to say, would you talk like that to a male, tall, white, 50-year professor with that attitude? That maybe is more underlying problem there. Okay, so we shouldn't spend any more time on that, but I was just very disappointed that right after we spent maybe 20 minutes showing that, I was getting this kind of question again. Okay. What I was going to do. Okay, so we're going to continue talking about it. So earlier, on the updated slides, I actually have this introduction about Hayek. So
Friedrich August von Hayek was a political economist who had a tremendous influence upon how people in capitalist societies understand the concept of liberty. Controversially, for Hayek, liberty did not mean democracy or a commitment to a set of liberal ideals. Rather, Hayek believed that liberty was a policy which deliberately adopts competition, markets, and prices as its ordering principles. To Hayek's way of thinking, it was markets that guaranteed individual liberty, and by contrast, it was the interference of the state in markets which disrupted the operation of liberty and started society down, as he famously put it, the road to serfdom. Hayek was born into a minor part of the Austro-Hungarian aristocracy. His father, who came from a line of scholars, was a medical doctor and a part-time lecturer in botany. Hayek's childhood was filled with considerations of philosophy and economics. After a brief stint in the Austro-Hungarian army during the First World War, Hayek took up studies at the University of Vienna, obtaining doctorates in law and political science, and afterwards he became an academic economist. Hayek's career can be divided into two periods. The first, which ended towards the end of the 1940s, was spent mainly at the London School of Economics, where Hayek concerned himself with many of the macroeconomic debates of the day. The second half of Hayek's career was much more varied. From 1945 onwards, in first Chicago and later Freiburg, Los Angeles and Salzburg, Hayek wrote and lectured on a whole range of subjects. Economics, yes, but also politics, psychology, philosophy, and the philosophy of science. And while he officially retired in 1968, it was actually in the 1970s and 80s that Hayek enjoyed his greatest moments of influence, being awarded the Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences in 1974 and subsequently being enormously influential upon the governments of Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher. During Hayek's stay at the London School of Economics, which he joined in 1931, he wrestled with a number of the then contemporary debates within economic theory. Much of this revolved around the business cycle, which, put simply, is the way in which economies grow and contract. Traditional economic theory held that, over time, economies find themselves in equilibrium. In short, gluts and shortages should balance themselves out via market mechanisms, leading to the optimal distribution of resources within an economy. The problem was that the economic peaks and troughs seemed to keep occurring, and they also seemed to be more dramatic than they should be. When the world economy stagnated and then crashed in the late 1920s and the 1930s, fierce debate began as to why this had occurred. Coming at economics from a fairly classical position, Hayek focused on issues of supply. He noticed that when economies were in recession, central banks often artificially injected more money into the economy by printing cash, or else, or in addition, by holding interest rates low to encourage investment rather than saving. Hayek argued that this was a mistake. When money was too readily available, entrepreneurs invested in products which were not necessarily desired by consumers. When these products went unsold, companies would go bankrupt, leaving industrial capacity invested where it need not be. In addition, cheap credit incentivized long-term capital investment, and Hayek argued that this too was a problem because it limited the possibility of entrepreneurs attempting to realize short-term gains which would actually kickstart the economy. Resisting the temptation to meddle in the money supply was, for Hayek, crucial to solving the problems of the Great Depression. Hayek's colleagues at the London School of Economics were receptive to his more classical approach. But up the road in Cambridge, a very different set of ideas was emerging, centred on the thought of John Maynard Keynes. Keynes argued that the problems of the 1930s economy were located not so much in issues of supply, but rather of demand. For Keynes, the role of government was to invest in public works, the buildings of roads, for example, which would create employment and therefore give people money to spend, stimulating economic growth. For Keynes, full employment was therefore not only a laudable social goal, but vital for the economy too. Keynes's demand-led economics was fundamentally at odds with Hayek's ideas. Hayek felt that Keynes's focus on full employment would require governments to keep increasing money supply. This in turn would create severe inflation of the kind that had wiped out his family's savings when 1920s Austria had suffered a bout of hyperinflation. Throughout the 1930s, Hayek and Keynes corresponded with each other, argued bitterly, and found very little common ground. During the Second World War, they even met under bizarre circumstances. Because of the German bombing campaign against London, the LSE had been evacuated to Cambridge. One night, Keynes and Hayek were assigned to fire watch duty together on the roof of the chapel of King's College. Sadly, we don't know what it was they talked about throughout that night. The opening of the second half of Hayek's career is marked by his first foray out from dry economic arguments and the publication of what is probably his most famous work, The Road to Serfdom. Hayek saw the writing of this book as a form of war work, forced upon him because, as a former enemy combatant, Hayek was refused official service in the British war effort. Against the backdrop of Keynes's ideas on planning, which had become accepted within British government circles, The Road to Serfdom was an attempt to save people from themselves, or more accurately, from central government. Hayek put forward several key arguments. Firstly, that there was nothing intrinsic to Germans as a race of people that had caused them to adopt authoritarian forms of government. Hayek rejected the idea, somewhat popular at the time, that there was something about German culture, or indeed inherent to Germans as a race, which predisposed them to authoritarian and expansionist forms of government. Secondly, Hayek argued that where Germany and the Soviet Union too, for that matter, had gone wrong was in undertaking state planning that interfered in the natural operation of markets. For Hayek, the problem with state planning was that it necessarily involved offering up responsibility for deciding upon a plan to a single individual. In a bureaucratic system such as the state, Hayek argued, someone had to ultimately decide on what course of action should be taken, and that person's judgment would necessarily have to be deferred to, and deferred to repeatedly over a given period of time. In this sense, planning led societies to sleepwalk into dictatorship. Thirdly, not only did Hayek worry about the inherent need for planners to defer to a single individual, but also he was concerned that fundamentally no one individual could actually make rational choices in regards to economic problems, due to them not having enough information to base their decisions upon. To be clear, it was not that Hayek necessarily condemned dictatorship. After all, his vision of liberty was a society in which markets were the principal method of economic organization, not necessarily one where society collectively decided upon governments via the ballot box. To this end, Hayek was comfortable with dictators who adopted free market economic policies involving minimal state intervention in a nation's economy. But dictators who undertook economic planning were, for Hayek, the really great evil. Hayek saw it like this. Markets are extremely complicated networks with millions, if not billions, of transactions going on all the time. Even consideration of some of the basics of market transactions shows this. Items are bought and sold, commodities are invested in and divested from, and famines and bumper crop yields affect how much there is to eat and how much it will cost to acquire it, in keeping with the laws of supply and demand. When individuals make choices as to whether or not to buy a commodity, they affect that commodity's price. If it becomes scarce, its price increases. If it becomes plentiful, its price falls. In this sense, the free market acts as a kind of constant referendum on the value of goods within an economy. For Hayek, the market represented a form of collective agreement made amongst all of the people operating in that market as to the value of particular goods and services. And against the collective wisdom of hundreds or thousands or millions of people, what could one single planner hope to offer that represented a superior form of wisdom? Liberty for Hayek, therefore, was to be found in letting the market do its work. The Road to Serfdom launched Hayek's later career. Instantly it became a bestseller. During the Second World War, its print run was limited due to paper shortages, and obtaining a copy was nigh on impossible due to sheer demand. In the United States of America, a condensed Reader's Digest version of the book brought the message to a very large public. So too did a series of lectures delivered by Hayek during 1945 at various venues in the United States. Hayek, cold-shouldered by British policymakers and economists, was delighted at the reception he received in the US, and in 1950 he moved to the University of Chicago, which became the center of neoliberal economic thinking, with which Hayek was closely associated, much as Cambridge had been the locus for Keynesian economics. But despite the popular acclaim of The Road to Serfdom, two negative reactions irked him. First of all, some of his own colleagues, normally sympathetic to the ideas he put forward, saw The Road to Serfdom as a kind of lightweight form of journalism, rather than as a form of scholarship. Keynes, who read The Road to Serfdom, sent Hayek what was, for the most part, a complimentary message about its content. However, towards the end and in quick order, Keynes challenged Hayek as to where he would draw the line on government planning. Some planning was clearly needed. Hayek was not an economic anarchist after all, but Keynes challenged where would the line be drawn. It took Hayek many years to work out his response to Keynes, who died in 1946, but the response eventually came in 1960 in Hayek's book, The Constitution of Liberty. The book laid out Hayek's practical vision for where the line between the state and the market should be drawn, and it was highly influential among the political right. In an anecdote, a story is told that at a meeting with the Conservative Research Department in 1975, Margaret Thatcher responded to a policy paper on political philosophy by reaching into her handbag and withdrawing a copy of The Constitution of Liberty. Holding it aloft, Thatcher declared, "This is what we believe." As the 20th century unfolded, Hayek's ideas gained more common currency. The notion that the state should limit itself to providing a legal framework within which entrepreneurs can engage with free markets is now at the heart of much of economic thinking. Many politicians and large sections of the public too are sceptical about the ability of the state to plan and undertake anything but the most simple of economic tasks, and this owes much to Hayek's warnings about the anti-libertarian perils of planning and the inability of planners to truly understand the world around them. Even when the financial crisis of 2008 hit the world economy, leading to a prolonged recession, faith in government planning was not restored in the popular imagination. This was best testified to by The Road to Serfdom hitting the #1 spot on the Amazon book bestseller list in early 2010, despite it having been written over 60 years ago.
Okay, so this one is this Hayek is very important, and particularly for Chinese students, because China's economy is actually right at this stage, right? How you have political system of not a democratic political system, but you have trying to develop a free market, right? And so there's a key line of, is it possible? For Hayek, he believes that it's fine if the political leader is adopting the market policies, right? To help adopt policies to help the market to work, right? But then there will be also the risk of the transition from one leader to the next leader, right? And so for his idea, I think probably for all the economists' idea, nobody agrees on that. Everybody is clear they should not have a central planner, because one person, like I said, right, one person would not be able to planning a whole complicated market. They should give the let the demand and supply decide, let the individual that in the economy collectively decides, right? Let the market force play out. While the Keynes, actually they more believe on democracy, they should think in the political freedom and the economic freedom should go joined together. So this is very important for the Chinese economy, and to some extent very important for the Australia economy as well. If I don't know how much you guys will be aware of the Australia political system, right? So I think to understand this is, I don't expect all of you to become the economy policy maker or something, or observer, but if you are interested in this, I think Hayek's, the short briefing, the easy ones is for you to where you start. And if you really will see yourself that's your path you're going to go, then probably should read 2 of his books. That's very especially important for nowadays, given China's economy. Anyway, so that's the basics of neoliberalism coming from, and then now, because we're going to talk about the pros, so assessment of the neoliberalism. So I'm going to first let you watch this very short Harvard X1 on the pros and the cons.
Neoliberalism is a term for the political and economic policies associated with unrestrained free market global capitalism. The term was popularized in the 1980s by Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher, and economist Milton Friedman, and is still prominent today. Proponents of neoliberalism see free markets and free trade as a foundation for human flourishing, creating the most favorable conditions for individual liberties, job growth, technological innovation, and transnational collaborations that promote peace and global prosperity. They believe that government interference with free market systems promotes waste, inefficiency, and stagnation. They reject regulations on industries, high taxation, and public services that are not subject to market competition, and believe in shrinking the size of government and restricting its functions to the protection of private property through policies and law enforcement, the facilitation of global commerce, and the maintenance of a strong military. Critics of neoliberalism argue that neoliberal policies exacerbate rather than mitigate economic and social inequalities. They cite the effects of unregulated capitalism and the reduction or removal of safety nets typically provided by governments to support those who are economically and socially vulnerable. More fundamentally, many critics assert that neoliberalism fails to account for structural forms of violence, such as systemic poverty, racism, and other forms of discrimination. They argue that these hinder equal access to the benefits of free market capitalism that neoliberals imply are universally shared. By failing to acknowledge structural forms of oppression, many neoliberals assert that it is individual failings rather than systemic inequality that lead to social and economic vulnerability. As with other political and economic systems, religions function to both support and challenge neoliberalism in local, national, and global contexts.
Okay, so that's the assessment, or it reflects a mentality of how the globalists in the recent years see the neoliberalism, right? Because as we show, many of the countries actually experience the widening of income inequality and the poverty, the portion of people living underneath poverty increase. But we also see some of the country has a good experience, is like the UK, like earlier the Hayek shows clear, because Thatcher is drawing a clear, he believes in Hayek, and particularly the second one, that where the government and the market should separate. And then also China and Germany that adopt the socio-economic system. But relatively, China is in the socio-economy has a lot of state control, right? That's why this topic is probably going to be still, for China, it's halfway challenging, that's still on the road. Okay, so now let's talk more detail on this neoliberalism's assessment. How do we understand the critique on this, right? So where the areas it has been successful, the international trades, although we know in some of those countries there are a lot of live under poverty, but the international trades also lift many people out of poverty, right? China would be the best example of this. China's heavy export of those labor-intensive products that creates employment with lower, human capital in it, right? Because so they are more labor type rather than technology type of inputs. So, and those creates employment and income for these people, right? Thinking about a lot of the major part of China's economic growth and the people's income is coming from manufacturing that for exports. So it's an evident example. The second area that is successful is through the foreign direct investment. Right. The foreign direct investment is different from the foreign portfolio investment, right? Because the portfolio investment coming through the capital market, that the foreign investors can pour out quickly once they lose the interest or lose the confidence of this economy. But foreign direct investment are the funds that are going into the corporations. So they could be built into machines. They could be used into training peoples, right? Increase the human resources. And they could be developed into the buildings or something. They're all long-term projects. They might be already realized somewhere. They cannot pour out quickly, right? So therefore, they are not going to likely to create the chaos as like in the Asian financial crisis or Argentina peso crisis, right? And the foreign direct investment, because they come in invest in firms, which could be manufacturing firms, technology innovative firms, they also bring in the technology and the management skill, right? And those knowledge and the skills will stay with the country again, right? So that's why the foreign direct investment is actually a successful capital flow across the board. And again, China is a large benefit of this, right? A lot of those companies that produce exports are companies through foreign direct investment. And also you see that China have capital control, but no foreign direct investment control. The capital control is mainly limited the capital coming in that invest on the security market that has a lot of limitation and regulation, but not on the foreign direct investment. Now, the third successful area is the privatization. Now, the privatization sort of failed in Argentina and Chile, but the partial privatization is quite successful in China, and also in UK is for actual privatization. And so the privatize those state firms in some countries will remove the physical burden. For example, in UK, before the privatization, the water, energy, etc., were all run by the government. So the expenses, those water companies' expenses will be the government's fiscal expenses, right? And because they're so important to the citizens, so they have to provide the water, electricity at a low price. That actually creates a loss, right? And then it becomes a burden on the physical government expenditure. So during such a time, so when she privatized those ones, those companies then become run by the private companies, right? So it's no longer the burden for the government physical. But another phenomenon which is outside of this is because it's run by the private companies, the price of those water electricity actually goes up, right? Because the private company have to make profits. So these are the areas that's successful. Now, what are the areas that the neoliberalism has failed or has trouble in most of countries? The first one is the free movement of the cross-border capital. We have mentioned many times, right? That will be eventually, not all of them, but they will impose the very high risk of capital flows that cause currency crisis. Now, the second area that has problem is the austerity of government, reduce the fiscal deficits and the debt level. Now, this one is not conclusive. Why it's inconclusive? Because in some country, that actually worked, while in some country, it does not work, right? And in some country, even the debt level goes up, the economy goes well. That's like in US, right? So there's all kinds of scenario happens in regarding on this austerity of the government. Now, particularly, so let me elaborate more. On the capital account liberalization, you guys all already know that's a potential risk there, right? Now, but why people do that anyway? Why people want to open capital market, even knowing that might be a risk, right? So the motivation comes from because the financial market increase the capital allocation of efficiency. We already know that, right? So if you have capital account liberal across countries, now you have capital allocation or resources allocation efficiency be done at a global level rather than your domestic level, right? So that's the efficiency improvement. But the global transfer of the capital will be also bring global transfer of the risk, right? Remember what we talked about the financial market? It transfers the funds, but it also transfers the risk, right? Therefore, when you have the global transfer of the risk, and not only now your economy are exposed to your domestic economy risk, but also the foreign risk, right? Now, I'm giving you one example of, so I can't use the Asian financial crisis because the US, etc. was fine, but they were losing the confidence in Thailand. That's where the domestic economy has problems. Now, and one example on this global capital transfer. is Japan and the US, right? So after Bretton Woods system, or the Second World War, so Japan's economy was rebuilt. And so for around the 50s and the 60s, Japan was in the situation like China today. They had a lot of surplus in the 1670s. They have a lot of surplus. And they were storing up a lot of US dollars, right? And the capital investment allowed them to go purchase securities in US and even the real estate in US at a certain time. The famous, they called the Empire Building in New York was owned by Japanese businessmen. Right. But then in the 80s and the 90s, Japan starts to have the problem of their banking system and a lot of bankruptcy, etc., right? And even today, Japan's economy has been struggling ever since then. And that will allow Japan to pull out actually their funds from US, right? And now what happens? Thinking about the global economy. So you have Japan pull funds out of US, and the US investors were investing in some other aging economy at that time. Do you see how the risk being transferred, right? Japan's economy in problem, they pull out funds, they have to fire sell their assets in US. Now the US assets gets cheaper. What happens to the US investors who initially put investment in, say, Thailand or Singapore or Malaysia? Now their domestic assets become cheaper. That means they are going to be able to make higher return domestically than in Thailand. They will pull funds out of Thailand back to the domestic, right? And in this chain, now the Thailand would have a sudden, I'm just hypothetically saying Thailand, it's not at the same time. You have to say it's not at exactly the same time, but it is actually partially related as well, because in the Asian financial crisis, Japan was also having the banking crisis. That's actually there. So now the capital flow out of Thailand. Thailand was sudden hit with the capital outflow, and where does the risk come from? If you trace all the way, it's coming from Japan's domestic economy problems, right? But through the capital investment, this chain can quickly spread to Thailand. Now you see the global risk transfer. All right. Now, once you see this, you see the benefits of the FDI, because FDI wouldn't have the sudden, quick flow of risk. Right. Now, this is on the capital account. Now, so then basically on many countries, their experience of open up capital account become open up for troubles, right? So this shows the surge of foreign capital inflows increase the chance of financial crisis, and such inflow worsen inequality in a crisis. So this shows basically the time periods of basically the probability of crisis in different time. The green one actually shows the full time period, while the orange one shows the time period after they had a lot of influx of capital. Right? You see, influx of capital seems to be a good thing, but actually the likelihood of crisis happens increase dramatically after the insurge of the capital. Now, so from here, I want to bring you guys back to the reality again. Think about China's current capital control, right? Now, what happens? You immediately open the capital account. And then I think in one of the class, one student raised the hand saying he will move, his dad will move all the money out of China. Let's say supposedly that happens. What happened to China's economy? Immediate state will be a crash, right? The investment goes out, a lot of assets being sold, fires out, money goes to another country. Now, hypothetically, let's say it mainly goes to US and Australia and maybe UK or France, some major countries. And let's make it taking on US. So what happens? Most of the assets goes to U.S. Those funds goes to U.S. Think about the size of China's, how much savings people are having in China, right? China's having several largest banks in the world. And all those savings are people's, people's savings, those deposits in the banks. I'm just saying hypothetically, if that happens, people are all moving their money out to U.S., what happened to the U.S. assets price? Goes up, right? And when this car price goes up, what happens to your capital, the business people's capital? They will flow out of U.S. because assets here is too expensive, right? They have to looking for more cheap opportunities, go somewhere. And at that time, where is the assets is at a cheaper price? In China, right? Now you see the irony here? That's what I'm saying. You might think capital open, I'm going to fly out, this seems good for me. No, it may not, right? You are selling your assets at a cheap price, goes to U.S. buying high price assets, while the real smart money would go to the place where have cheap assets, high returns. You see the point? Now, but when I talk about as a circle, what I did not talk about, I'm making an assumption here. Actually, more than one assumption here. What's the assumption in this circle? Transaction cost is less a problem. More other things. Policy stability, political stability, right? Saying that the people who are willing to come putting money back into China because assets is cheap is based on an assumption that this open capital account is going to sustain. The country is going to be in political stability, right? So it's purely out of the market return consideration they're willing to come back. But once you're adding into political stability or other things, then it might actually affect. Now, so would you make it simple? Let's just make us arrogant for here. Let's say we can predict. Let's try to predict would Chinese government making capital account open anytime soon? And when would it be Chinese government more likely to make the capital account open? And when they would be more likely to make it open? What China is doing all these years, every year is what you hear. Harmony society, they want stability, right? That's the key. That's the key. As long as they're never comfortable with the stability of society, they will not open the capital account, right? Because this circle wouldn't happen. They will know they were just the only outflow, no inflow. When people don't trust this economy is going to be stable, sustainable. That's why they need to solve this stability problem and the sustainability. Stability and sustainability, two different things. One is you being stable and safe. One other one is you sustainably, persistently being good. Okay, so this is the application of this to China. Now, on the government austerity, what is its situation? So we said on the role of governmental austerity, there's all kinds of results, right? So it has been successful in many countries, but also be failed in many countries. And the largest failure example is Russia's shock therapy. Not only Russian, but a lot of Eastern European countries. And those Eastern European countries, if historically, They were like China after the Second World War. They are state-controlled. They are actually run by the communism parties. So that was a historical thing, right? So in the 80s and early 90s, some 80s, right, most of those Eastern European countries went through either politically split up or aggregate by Russian or at that time called Soviet Union, or even break up with Soviet Union. There's political struggle. And then in the economic policy, most of them went through the shock therapy. And most of them failed badly. And so they are typical failure. And actually referring to this shock therapy, the main designer of this shock therapy is actually a Harvard professor. He is a Russian, and he is on the Russians' most wanted list these days. He is actually a very smart professor and very productive. And one time in a casual talk with another Russian professor of a younger generation, we joked saying, what if this person wins Nobel Prize? And he said, we will quit, actually not just one person, we will quit the profession if the Nobel Prize goes to him. But that's a joke, that's how Russian people hate the shock therapy, and including the person who designed this. Okay. Now the limits, so the government austerity, the main role or the main purpose is to limit the size of the physical deficit and the government debt, right? But the question is, what is an optimal level of government debt? How do we know whether this government, with this level for this country, is too much debt or too little debt? Right? That's the first question. Second, even if we know there's a level, is this level the same for all countries? Right? So clearly the reality is telling us each country, how much that country are able to take the debt level is different, right? U.S. has been taking debt level above 150% of GDP for many, many years, U.S., and it was fine, right? But for Greek, once they're over 130%, the economy is breaking down, right? And in China, do you guys know how much government debt over GDP is 10 years ago and today? Unbelievable. 10 years ago, it was less than 80%. And nowadays, 230% over GDP. For a long time, China was saying, look at US has such long debt. But now look at China today. The increasing rate in the past year is unbelievably high. And most of that, you guess where they're coming from, or who are the borrowers? Of course, they're government, right? Most of those government debt are local government debt that are borrowed by Chinese saying 城投债. It's basically the urban development and investment funds that all the each local government or municipal actually have one of those companies established sometime in the past 10 years. And they will borrow money as with the local government guarantee. And then when this money comes in, they are mostly invested in real estate. So now you also understand why there's behind the real estate price goes up so much, right? Okay, so then we have talked about a lot on the economy, how it's linked to each other, right? So what happens if real estate price crash? I'm saying what if, then I'm going to explain you why the government is so concerned about never wouldn't let it happen. So what will happen if the real estate price drop? What happens? Those investment local government debt wouldn't be paid, right? Now, it's the government debt guaranteed by local government. Then what happens? Either you have to let it go bankruptcy, then that is going to be the investor is going to lose the money, right? Or the government have to use their physical expenses to pay for those bonds because they are the guarantors, right? Then in that case, it becomes a real government debt now rather than just guaranteed debt, right? Or what if they let those debt default? Right, so the investor who bought this is going to lose the money. And who are the investors bought this debt? They could be people just household savings. They could be other companies, right? And then if this household, when the household loses saving, what happens to the household behavior? Reduce consumptions, right? And if those companies losing this money, what happens to their behavior? Reduce their investment, right? So this is going to into a whole recession, right? That's why for a long time, the government can't let the real estate to fail, and they have to keep pumping the funding. And that's why this debt market just keep roll up so fast in the past 10 years. Now, I think only last week, or maybe early this week, the central government announced the local government are not going to guarantee this bond anymore. If those bond or those called urban development and investment company having financial distress, having difficulty to pay their debt, the central government is telling the local government not to guarantee them, just let them go bankruptcy. What do you think of this policy effect? Increase investment risk, and then very good. Then what happens to the bond yield, required return? Goes higher, right? People will be, and what happens to their ability to borrowing? Decrease, right? And that's what's going to happen. It's going to slow down those bonds roll-off, right? So this is a very good policy to take. There is certain risk in it, but it's actually very good. And this government should have learned to take this policy many years ago. So they wouldn't actually let this bubble go so big. So now they're at least taking a good step to slow it down. Now, but would this be successfully pulling through and cool the market? It really depends on how many bad apples there are already, right? If there's already many of those funds that are at the time of they need to repay the bond, and they can't, and they don't have local government guarantee, it will trigger the bankruptcy and the recession mechanism we talked, right, just a minute ago. Then that will be a bad situation. But if most of those funds, at least in short term, they can manage it, then this policy would give them time, but also the pressure for those funds themselves to slow down and to adjust, right, to avoid bankruptcy. Then this will have a soft, so they like to use the word soft landing. So we're going to observe how it goes, but it will take quite some time to see the results, and particularly, the government at this point, they have to do it is because of the trade war is also going on, right? If they don't fix this, they're really going to have two things come together, right? So that will be coming, as we just said, this is the related issue of how do you pace reducing your government debt, right? If you reduce your government debt too quick, that might actually trigger the recession. But if you reduce it too slow, you might allow this debt to grow into too large, right? That's exactly the Chinese example is going through right now. Okay. So are we clear? And you could apply all those to China's situation, particularly. Okay, so then what are the benefits to reduce government debt? There are benefits and costs, right? Now the benefits, right, so it's sort of, when the government is in health situation, you will more likely to be able to sustain us through this crisis time, or this crisis is less likely to happen, right? And then the but is low debt or is high level debt bad for economic growth? This is actually not true, right? Because it brings a risk, but it might grow the high growth. But it really depends on whether that level of risk is still safe for this particular economy. Now the cost argument side, right? So if you want to reduce debt, there's two ways. One is you raise the income of the government income, physical income, which is through tax, right? You have to raise more tax. And raise more tax will discourage business, right? Because the corporation have to pay more tax, and you will reduce the incentive to investment, which actually turns out to be bad for the economy. Another way of reducing the debt is to reduce the spending, right? Reduce the spending might also reduce the government investment, which might also be bad for the economy. So that's why there are many costs that could be associated with reducing the debt, right? So that's why on this debt issue, it's not a clear answer, right? So there are benefits, there are also could be problems some. And the most important key question then in the end is actually what is optimal for that particular country. Not one size of debt is going to be fit for every country. Now, so after this neoliberalism failure has been noticed by probably just early this century, people notice it because they start to do a lot of those policy changes in the 70s, 80s, and the 90s, right? And by the 90s, or by the financial crisis, there had been a lot of bad experience, like Argentina, Russia, and Asian. Most of those emerging countries probably all go through the crisis, maybe other than China. So then this recent of the policy and also the economists, they have been rethinking about, is this neoliberalism having promoted too much, right? But they see benefits of it as well, so they start to revise on certain things, and the major areas of revising is about the key one is redistribution, right? That's why you see in the past 20 years, many countries adopted a lot of social welfare programs to help the poor or the unemployed go back to work, gain working skills, or having the welfare that is, I don't know whether it's a good one when you just give free money. I'm a market believer that you should influence people's incentive to work rather than just give them money to make them have incentive to be lazy. That's different, right? So in the past 20 years, a lot of these countries is implement the social welfare program that to redistribute the income, right? That could increase a lot, including a lot of, for example, the fund that are giving out to retraining people when they lose job, or just give free money to people who are unemployed. That I don't know. And also including to have a lot of policies that are setting up schools or tuition waivers for the kids from more poor backgrounds, right? And all this is the liberty thing that we have been seeing so much in the past things, right? And then the second revised point is to have physical consolidated targets at a medium term. So previously they want to reduce, they're like, let's do this, right? Right now they just slow down. Let's, instead of setting it as a short-term goal, but let's set a mid-term goal, what it could be like. Because then in this process, the country can assess its own healthy debt level. Now, another revised point is on the capital flow, right? Because we see some countries benefited from this full capital flow, but emerging countries seems to always suffer from this full capital flow, right? So on this one, the revision is more like you can take middle step to let your own country benefit of certain area of openness, but also give your own country domestic time to build up. That is exactly what China is experiencing. So part of the WTO deal is China needs to open the banking industry, right? So when the banking industry was open, was having many stages from 2000 to 2006. So they even up to today, there was actually several stages already going through. You guys might not notice. The capital control is still in place, but foreign banks are allowed to go into China. From the first step is allowed to go into China. They can lend to corporation at their own discretion, or very beginning is they're allowed to deal with the foreigners business in China, but then they can dealing with domestic firms in China. And then slowly starting into even the foreign banks can take the ownership or partial ownership of Chinese banks. This is something happens around the early 2000 plus. You see all those Deutsche Bank, HSBC, they all have joint venture. For example, I think Deutsche Bank took over Beijing Huaxiang Yinhang. HSBC collaborate with Agriculture Bank of China. Right? So they have the equity to move in. The equity moving in is still better. It's still the FDI. It's not the security market. Because when they buy the equity, it's a blocked share. They will not be able to sell it quickly on the market in the block shares. Now, after the split share reform, it starts to change, but they always have this in place. So even they want to pull out quickly, if you want to sell to HSBC, I think have 10% of Agricultural Bank of China, it is a big road. It will be very hard to have block transfer happening, right? They themselves may suffer the loss in this process. And so this is a capital, so it's like a step-by-step capital sort of financial market opening, right? It's through this collaboration, joint venture, the banks in China can learn certain skills from the foreign banks through certain transactions. Then the next stage you will see those Chinese banks goes to Hong Kong market, goes to overseas market, right? That's, I think, in this process you see. And then another revised point is how to combine the market and the government regulation. This is a very original point of Hayat, that the government should have policy, but those policy is not direct intervention with the market, but to adopt a policy that helps the market to do a better job. Right? For example, reduction transaction, remove the entry barrier, etc. Okay, so the other critics is involved on this is the political interference, right? So that is coming from, in the Asian financial crisis, remember how the Korean called IMF, right? Because they were providing funding support, but those funding support comes with a lot of requirement for the changes in the financial structure and sometimes the political influence structure in it, right? That's one. And another critic is the inequality. Of course, I mentioned mainly is the inequality of the poor and the rich, right? But I think, today, this class, we're talking a lot about the gender equity. At everywhere, if you're looking at in the society, at where people are poor, the worst suffering are the kids and the women, maybe not in China, regarding kids part. But the female always suffers worse. And if you see anywhere in the world, the human rights are poor, it was even poorer for women. I'm not trying to be a feminism or anything, but I actually think, I encourage everybody to become feminism. It's about equality. In the end, it's going to hurt the men as well. This is the reality. It's the gender bias. It's almost everywhere, even in the most developed countries. And on this, I actually have to say, Australia is actually on the good ends in terms of gender equity, but he probably still sees a lot. And the negligence of contribution of infrastructure, that's another, right? So you see this is typical part in the early days, so let's say China's economy kick-off. How many of you have, how old are you guys are born in, middle 90s, right? Okay, middle 90s is a time that Shanghai, the east side of Shanghai was building up crazily with all the high-lock skies, right? But then a majority of China is still having a time that don't have the major roads. The major roads infrastructure happens in China after 97. And still those major infrastructure of highway build was focused on connecting the capital cities in China rather than the small cities. Okay. So that's, again, it's an unequal distribution of the infrastructure, right? So making the rich ones actually also the government providing more infrastructure, making them development for them easier, while the poor places that are not developed yet, they don't provide as much investment in their infrastructure, for example, roads. That will be, when you don't have roads, can you have business? You cannot have business, right? That's another. So the government unequal distribution of the infrastructure can drive further this inequality. The neglect of environment issue, that's something that's been hot for some time, is China's particular pollution issue, right? And the long-term vision of productivity. This is, again, in China, and this is actually because the development is so much for China, is the innovation. Right, because China was relying on so much just to produce manufacturing cheap, labor-intensive products. And they didn't protect, they don't have this copyrights ideas, or they just, in early days, it was good for China not to respect the copyrights, because then they can copy a lot of products at low cost, right? And then they give China a competitive advantage on the international trade market. But that's short term. In long term, what you happened is then you enforced this culture of disrespect copyrights, right? And also you discourage innovation. Because if you are a corporation operator in a country that you know if you innovate something, your neighbor is going to copy right away without punishment, are you going to be willing to innovate? Right? And as a result of it is technological breakthrough in China don't happen. It's just keeping, so China has, after China had developed for 30 years, so that's like 10 years ago, right? They realized they need to make transition. They want people to remember from made in China to innovated in China. And they write that in the China's every 5-year plan. And this, you guys should know the China's 5-year plan, right? That's the development ever since China's economy in the 50s. They always have the 5-year plan so that they can, every 5 years, they will establish their goal. All those goals in those 5-year plan have been achieving very well until the recent 2, because they were putting environment issue and innovation issue in this 5-year plan, and they cannot fully achieve. This is exactly where the short-term goal that erodes the long-term vision of productivity. Okay, so that's today's class. Mainly we introduce the neoliberalism and how in the world several countries experience it, where they are successful, where they are failure. And then the most part I want you guys to think about is what China, and because that's the major country that's given its importance, its stability, is going to have a big impact in global countries, also in Australia, because of the tight international trade relation with China. Okay. How does neoliberalism apply to China, and how do we understand where China is and what are the major challenges in the context of the Hayek's and the neoliberalism? Okay. Any questions?
You said that when we transform from state owner to private owner, the price will increase.
Basically, when in that context, when we say state versus private, basically means the government versus actually everybody else. It could be individual, it could be corporation.
But actually, from my point of view, in my country, when we privatize some state owner corporation, the price becomes cheaper.
Yes.
How do you think it's just in the first time and later the price will increase?
You mean the product's price become cheaper?
Yeah.
That's possible. Because part of the reason, that's why our next week, we're going to talk a lot on the state capitalism and the privatization. The main reason is, part of the reason the state is running the state-owned firm become a cost to the government is because they run inefficiently. Then that will become a cost, right? And then once you have the private to run, they might run it more efficiently. And then at the same time, they may allow competition, and all those might help the product price actually go cheaper. And some of the state-owned company actually could be operate at very profitable level. For example, in China's telecommunication, because they are monopoly. And the monopoly position gives them power to price high and then less quantity. And when they privatize, the latter or the private companies or individuals start to participate, there will be more competition. The price can also come down.
And another question, how about the Russia now? They have liabilities on... They control the economy.
What is Russia now?
Because you said that before when Russia...
Or Russian,
Yes, open the markets, they have really big recession. But I can see now Russia have really good.
Yes.
Compared to Asia.
It took many years. Their shock in 96.
But they can recover.
Yes, they can recover. It took them almost, for the first 10 years was a big mess, but in the Putin time, they start to recover.
How about your thinking?
How about my thinking on what?
For example, Vietnam have the same problem with China. But how do you think maybe we accept recession in the short term, or maybe we will gain another benefits in the long term?
I think Vietnam are actually doing very well. In this year's class, I didn't talk too much in Vietnam. I actually used to like to talk about Vietnam a lot. I even used to have a case on Vietnam. I think it's doing very well. Because the policies, the reforms started later than China. So you can have a lot of actually lessons learned from China because you are a bit one step behind. But in certain area, Vietnam actually has done better than China. I don't know how interested you guys are. And for example, land. China's land has been just using usage rights given to people when the economy starts to kick off, right? Even for today, they are still not acknowledging the land ownership. While Vietnam does much better in this. It's actually ahead of China first because you also go through the communism time, right? You're actually giving the use right, like the rights usage to the people much earlier than China, and then the ownership sort of the structure. And China is still in the middle of doing this. Go ahead.
I think neoliberalism is another problem. Like if you see the case of Chinese-owned enterprise,
Mm-hmm.
there is a huge amount of money invested in Africa,
Mm-hmm.
and, but those companies they operate in Africa, but
Mhm.
they hire Chinese laborers
Mhm.
and they use local resources.
Mhm.
And, sometimes they destroy the local environment,
Mhm.
and so there are not so many local people
Mhm.
hired by the Chinese
Mhm.
company. So this actually didn't improve the life of the local people.
Mhm.
So the money is a trade between
Mhm.
the African countries,
Mhm.
government.
Mhm.
Sometimes the governments are
Mhm.
dictatorship, are
Mhm.
authoritarian, but
Mhm.
those governments have money, but local people they benefit.
Yeah, what your observation is very good, but that's not realism promoting. Remember, the neoliberalism is encouraging free economy, right? Reducing the government role. Now, from what you're saying is, it's not neoliberal, even from China's point of view. It's the government efforts. But the trick, the funny thing with Chinese economy is you have private and government go together, goes everywhere, even including the investment in Africa, right? So this is an FDI, foreign direct investment, but organized by foreign country to from the point of South African people's point of view, right? So you have a foreign country coming into our investment, and this investment are organized by the government. Along that, there are some private enterprise or Chinese goes with the government investment, particularly the Zhejiang Business Group. They are really good with doing those. When they goes there, right, there's just a partial of the private sector. And this, in terms of whether hire local or not hiring local, I wouldn't make the conclusion like you said. There are some company hiring local as well, and there are some not. Chinese business do have this tendency of confining to themselves. And okay, this is actually a big subject, but what I can say in short is China, Japan, Korea, US, UK, and France, many of those major countries are doing the same thing everywhere. And then there is a clear difference in who helps the infrastructure of the local, most beneficial from the local. And all I can say is, I don't want to get too much political. Japan and Korea are doing pretty well. China is somewhere in the middle. China is not the worst one. The criticism on China, you heard, are coming from the country we're actually doing the worst one. Okay. But like the Japan and Korea, I actually, even though they, particularly Japan invaded China, and I'm my countryside and my granddad was suffered from that. But you have to really admit, Korea and Japan, they really, sometimes we argue they got a Chinese culture a long time. They preserve much better. They were much more responsible global investors. And they don't brag. You don't see Japan and Korea brag about this and that. And I think that's something the Chinese should intend to learn from them. Are we still having time, or I think you guys will need to move to the next class? Okay.
May I ask you another thing?
Yeah, sure.
I think the neoliberalism will shock the sovereign nation system.
You're shocked.
will destroy that since there will be free capital flow and free human.
No, it's two different things. For example, you can see European Union. European Union is the extreme example of, they have everything free market among them, but they have independent government.
Yeah, they have
And even now their currency is completely pushes them to unification of the government, but it's still not happening. So the government is an economy can't be completely two different things, can't be separated. The constitution